She's currently working at JPMorgan Chase in sustainable finance. Previously, she was Chief Operating Officer of the USSIF, which is the Professional Association for Sustainable Finance. And so she'll be sharing a little of her experiences with that. She's presenting to us this morning from a boat in a harbor somewhere in California, and when you get to see her, you'll see that she's in a strange venue, and we'll let her tell as much as she wants or needs to about that. At any rate, it's my pleasure to welcome Jane, someone I actually she was a student of mine years and years ago here at Plymouth, and fun to have her back and to see her again and to reconnect. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jane. Jane, welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much. I'm just going to dive in here. All right. Agenda for today. First off, what is this field that I work in that we're talking about? What does investing for better mean? To understand that, I'm going to give you a little history of the field, and then we're going to talk about what's currently happening in terms of what's currently happening in finance, in government. Does this make any result? Does this really change the world for the better? Talk a little bit about what's happening either in the immediate near-term future or long-term and how that might impact you. And then let's talk about you and your choices and your money and what you can do with them. And then I'm going to try and leave 10, 15 minutes, 10 minutes maybe at the end for Q&A. And John will help facilitate Q&A. Final disclaimer, all opinions are my own. I've worked at some places. They have some names. This is all my interpretation based on working there and what I've learned, but not the views of any of my employers. A little bit about me. As John said, I'm currently on a sailboat in California. I was supposed to be staying with a friend for a friend's wedding, another friend's wedding. And my original host got sick. And in this day of not only not COVID, but just in general sick consciousness, I decided to camp out on a other friend's sailboat rather than pay for a hotel room because I love a boat and I happen to live on one, a 47-foot one in Washington, D.C., which is where I normally would be doing these sorts of calls from. If you want to sneak in a boat question or two during Q&A, we'll try and focus on finance, but the boat stuff is near and dear to my heart, and I think informs my love of the environment and of the oceans. All right, what do we mean by investing for better? You might call it sustainable investing, impact investing. You might have heard of ESG or SRI. There are a lot of terms that are thrown around: triple bottom line investing, responsible investing. Do any of these have specific definitions? Not really. Some of them are terms that have kind of come into vogue and out of vogue, we'll see in the history. Most of them don't have very specific, agreed upon exact terms, other than a few acronyms, which mean the words that they mean. So ESG means literally the words environmental, social, governance. It can be applied in a lot of different ways, and I'll talk about that in the history. It's gotten associated with some kind of the social leftist progressive part of ESG, but really it's much broader than that. And then the term that many of you may be familiar with is SRI, or socially responsible investing. Got very popular as a term, as the kind of term of art in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. Now a lot of people say sustainable investing. All of it really means the same thing. All of it tends to be a big tent umbrella that encompasses a lot of different approaches. Are you trying to not own bad companies? Are you trying to invest on a theme? Are you trying to own the best of the good companies? Are you trying to invest for women? Are you clean tech energy? Do you just care about social issues broadly? And are you like a responsible index? There are a lot of different approaches. And I'll tell you about the specific strategies, but in general, most of the umbrella terms kind of encompass all of it. So a lot of different terms flying around, a lot of different approaches. I thought I would give you my personal definition so that you understand what we're talking about. My definition: investing that takes into account the financial goals and non-financial values, beliefs, non-financial goals for the world, non-financial desires of the investor, and also balances positive impact along with risk and return. So you might be aiming for neutral impact, you might be aiming for really positive impact. All of that kind of becomes a metric that you can move the way that a financial advisor can move and talk about low risk and high risk. That's my definition of the whole field. Investing that balances finance and non-finance, as John said, two things a lot of people don't think to put together, and that thinks about the values of the investor. History, interestingly, here we are, Palm Sunday. I am talking to Plymouth. Really, the origins of, I use the term sustainable investing, have their traditions in religious investing traditions. Specifically, many different ones, but I'm going to call out Muslim finance tradition has some real edicts about where you can make money and how you can make money and how you can't. Usury, aggressive financing was forbidden. Methodists were early on in saying you should not make money in a way that harms your neighbors. The interpretation of that at that day and time was anti-slavery. You shouldn't invest, you shouldn't make your money, even if you're not personally a slave owner. Quakers soon followed. So religious tradition actually is what brings us here. But let's talk about the modern sustainable finance movement. I think there are kind of a few big things to call out. Started, I would say, in the late 60s, early 70s with the Vietnam War. Students calling for colleges to divest from companies like Dow Chemical because they made napalm. So Vietnam War student protests, protesting their college, protesting their university to do something with their money. Right around the same time and following after, the anti-apartheid movement used a lot of the same tactics. There was a lot of divestment movement. What I want to call out that I think is interesting about the anti-apartheid movement is that you start to get people saying, instead of not owning the company, these Catholic nuns were like, we're going to take our pension, we're going to own just enough of these companies to be a little poke in their side, to sit as a fly on the wall at their board meetings, to pressure them to divest or to, sorry, not divest, to engage in the Sullivan Accords, which were anti-apartheid. They were trying to get international companies to say, when they work in South Africa, we're going to pay blacks and whites equally. And instead of saying, don't own that company, they said, we're going to own and we're going to push it from the inside. Catholic nuns, radical Catholic nuns in the 70s. Then in the 80s, in the 90s, you get kind of this term socially responsible investing, SRI, that kind of grows, gets popular, and it can be customized a little bit. If you're Catholic nuns, you can not only pressure around anti-apartheid, but for instance, you might not want to own pharmaceuticals that make birth control pills. So you can customize your pension fund not to own those companies if you're Catholic. If you're after 3 Mile Island, if you're anti-nuke, you can customize your companies in your big retirement fund. And this is really mostly for big institutions, for high net worth individuals. You start to get the first mutual funds available for people in the 90s. And then I would say in the 2000s, you have the rise of the term ESG. You also have the rise of just using this data, whether or not you're pushing a progressive social investor. For example, environmental stuff, it's driven by climate change. Even kind of sane finance managers in any ideological spectrum are looking at environmental data for certain, if it's relevant to the project, if it's relevant to the company. Social data DEI stuff being driven by progressive investors who want this data, who want companies to move on it, and then governance being driven by meltdowns like Enron. And it doesn't really matter. You might not even be thinking about values. You're just thinking about good governance and good company policy. So ESG just means environmental, social governance. It starts to get used in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different terms, because it has relevance for each of these different groups. That's kind of the 2000s. And then here we are today. So let's talk about, that's kind of the history, religious movement, anti-war, anti-apartheid, to kind of niche values, to everybody is using ESG data in some way, but it's still got some social identity politics associated with it. So let's talk about today. As I'm saying, most fund managers use ESG data in some way. Here's an example of how they use it. Should a bond that backs waterfront construction in Miami be more or less risky than a similar building in Minneapolis? Think climate change, if you believe in it at all, whether you believe it's man-made or not, you just believe in the data of climate change, all of a sudden that bond should not have the same price. Risk is price in the bond world. So most sane finance fund managers are using environmental data. They're using governance data. Should a company have an independent auditor? What's the CEO pay relative to shareholder performance? Those are the sorts of governance data that professionals use, regardless of whether your fund is an ESG fund, whether you're a green investor. Most finance professionals use ESG data in some way today. Now, there are some specialized funds, some ETFs, some mutual funds, some, if you're a high net worth client, some wealth managers, some financial strategies that customize and that focus on things like gender. So if you're interested in gender lens investing, you're very wealthy, you can talk to your advisor about it. If you're just an ordinary investor, you can buy an ETF from State Street that focuses on gender. I think the ticker is SHE, S-H-E. So those sorts of specialized funds exist now at both the average investor level and at the high net worth level. And they use ESG data, but they use it with a kind of ESG goal. They might call themselves a sustainable fund. And then, as I'm mentioning here, clearly, there are wealth managers and financial advisors that now have enough expertise. Some of them have been in this field since the 80s, since they were helping Catholic nuns with their pensions, and with anti-apartheid. There are advisors that are younger and focused on newer issues like diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, racial justice, racial equity investing. So you can find a specialized person to help you. Again, the higher net worth, the more likely you are to be able to find somebody specialized. But even now, this field has broadened enough that you can find an ordinary middle class retail level financial advisor who can help you in this way. And we'll get into some specifics later. So what are they doing when I talk about these financial professionals that are trying to get a social goal or that will customize your account? What are they doing? Mostly here, we're talking about owning public companies. Sometimes we're talking about bonds in terms of environment, but mostly we're talking about public companies. And really, I think of it as three buckets of strategies that you can do. The first one is lean out. Don't own what you call a bad company. And bad can vary. It can be a Catholic value, pharmaceutical company, can be a Sharia finance laws, don't own non-halal meat. They wouldn't want to own Hormel, for instance, non-halal meat production. Also don't want to own alcohol, don't want to own tobacco, Sharia compliant law. Also, as an individual, whether or not you have Sharia values, maybe you just don't want to own alcohol. You don't want to own what are called sin stocks. You're organization that really cares about the animals. Your PETA's endowment doesn't want to invest in companies that do animal testing, and maybe you don't either. So those are the kind of, we call lean out, restrictions, do no harm, don't own the bad companies. The other approach that you can take, and I think that's gotten more popular in the last 20 years, is leaning in, intentionally owning good companies. We now have enough data that we can say, oh, this consumer goods company compared to this one treats their workers better. They've got better parental leave. They've got better partner inclusion in terms of their healthcare coverage. They've got gender inclusive, gender affirming care as part of their coverage. Whatever, a lot of that is now kind of public enough information that you can say, well, I would, between these two companies, between Home Depot and Lowe's, which I'm indifferent to, this one is much better in terms of all of these things I care about. So kind of overweight, lean in. That can also mean don't own fossil fuels, but lean into clean tech instead, clean energy. That's kind of an example of that group of strategies. And then the last one, going back to the radical Catholic nuns, you can choose to own a company enough to push them from the inside. So there have been people that are trying to push Exxon to do disclosure about climate change and what they understand and what their scientists know. And they're doing it by owning the company and then pressuring the board of directors. So shareholder engagement and advocacy. I think those are the three big strategies. Lean out, don't own the bad stuff. Lean in, extra own the good stuff. And you can combine, no matter what you own, pressure companies to be better. And some clients, some funds just do one of them. Fossil fuel free is just a lean out. Don't own fossil fuels. And you can find a mutual fund that does that if that's what you care about. You can just lean out. Some other funds, some strategies lean in, some do both. But I think of them as separate buckets. All right. John asked me over email, what's government's role in all this? There's a lot of back and forth between governments and investors in the finance world. In general, in the arc of history, what we see is that progressive investors push companies for data. They say, we want to know how many women you have on the board. Or they'll go and they'll look at their report and they'll look at every person's headshot and name and they'll kind of try and guess their gender. And then eventually enough investors decide that it's relevant and they're pushing enough companies, the companies kind of start to standardize maybe. And often government comes in at this level and helps say, well, enough people want this, enough companies are doing it, everybody should just disclose it. It's probably relevant for everyone. Here's the format everyone should use. And then that way, government helps standardize regulations so now even more investors have easy access to that information or more funds can use that information. And in particular, what I'll say is that a lot of times this is first and foremost driven in the EU era of government, and then it applies to multinational companies. So upcoming, very soon, kind of starting now and in the next few years, a lot of companies are going to have to disclose carbon emissions at various states and scopes. That's being driven by EU regulation, but being driven by regulation now because 10, 15 years ago, pension funds and schemes in the UK wanted it. So that's kind of the investor government interplay. Does this do anything? Why would you have your money do this? I think anti-apartheid teaches us, I hope, that finance is a tool that changes the world. But if you don't want to look to history, if you want to look to very modern movements, got two examples. One, as I've kind of talked about several times, this phrase of gender lens investing. Investors really pushed companies. Companies then had to start disclosing things. There's now this required EEO data, Employee Equal Opportunity Act data that discloses things like race and gender. So more investors. So this started out very high net worth, very wealthy people. So a woman named Suzanne Beagle was very interested in gender lens investing. because she pushed a lot of companies and then she started to attract other people. We got enough data that says that actually having women on the board, if you take two companies in the same sector, Home Depot versus Lowe's again, the company that has more diversity on its board will generally, on average, financially do better in each sector. And we know that because early investors pushed enough companies to disclose enough that we could start to do studies. And then the government came in and made everybody disclose. So we had a bigger data set to work with. So we could understand, is this really true? And the answer is yes. And the other answer is you actually really only get the effect when you get two women on the board. If it's just one, there's no magic. But when you get two women on the board, generally, you start to get better financial performance relative to your peers. And we now know that. And now California is passing laws about requiring companies that are incorporated there to have women on the board. And NASDAQ is saying that if you want to list your company there, you need to have certain percentage of women on the board. So that's kind of like an arc of history over the last 20, 25 years, I would say, of a real solid example of how we've seen change in the world. Another one that's happening is forced arbitration. This one is even more recent, but a bunch of shareholders, including, I'm going to shout out my friend Meredith Benton, who is not here, but she works in the field, and I might send her this recording. She helped organize investors who were really, again, interested in marginalized communities. And one of the things they targeted was forced arbitration contracts. So companies can have, as part of their employment agreement, this idea that sort of like health and safety violations, you can't sue the company. They didn't pay you your last wages, you can't sue them, you have to do forced arbitration. You got sexually harassed at your company, you can't sue them, you have to do forced arbitration. And this group of investors really wanted to change that, not because of any sort of financial performance. This is different than women on the board. This is just, I want to see this change in the world. This is unfair to marginalized communities, women, queer people, unfair. And so a bunch of investors pushed, a bunch of companies through shareholder engagement finally agreed to drop their forced arbitration clause. Kind of became a movement. Once you've got Apple and Google doing this sort of thing, are other companies going to follow suit or not? Eventually, it's now law. 2022, they amended the kind of Federal Arbitration Act that kind of governs employee agreements, saying that there's a carve out and that anybody kind of, no matter what employment contract they sign, has to be able to take sexual harassment, toxic workplace out of forced arbitration into the court system if they want to. And that's something that really, I think, kind of changed in the last 12 years, I would say, is the life cycle of that line item, of that kind of success of using finance as a tool to change the world. So what are we looking forward to? There's a big anti-ESG backlash happening right now. It's very identity politics driven. There are states such as Texas who are saying their state funds, their teachers' employee retirement funds, can't be invested in any fund that uses ESG. As I've said, everybody uses ESG. I think what's going to happen, so there's some news articles going on about this, there's lawsuits going on about this. I think what's going to happen is it's going to get narrowed. The rhetoric is going to center around DEI, around the social stuff. They're going to let governance kind of be something that any financial professional can consider. But I do think there is going to continue to be identity politics around the social aspect of investing. I think as part of this identity politics, we might see the term sustainable investing or socially responsible change to values-based. That's the move that I'm seeing even inside of JPMorgan right now, and it's public. We use this language publicly. So I'm not letting any cat out of the bag. It's their house view, but it's on Wikipedia as well. I think move to values. I think people hope get some of the identity politics out of it. I also think that there are some values. People are beginning to develop the way that you could have gender lens investing, they're looking at, could you invest with a veteran lens? Could you think about what company policies are that support veterans and mental health? And could you build a portfolio that way? So that's like a very new cause that's coming along that I think even red state Texas might be okay with. Well, that type of value is all right. So I think you're going to see the field move towards the term values-based investing. It still is going to mean the same thing. Sustainable investing, impact investing, whatever you call it, still meets my definition. I think you're going to keep seeing new ability to customize, new causes like veterans come up. In general, higher net worth will have access first, and then retail will eventually like get their own mutual fund version. And then, of course, there's the current and growing Israeli boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. I think that is only going to grow. Basically, there's always going to be a new frontier. In 20 years, maybe we're talking about ableism on the board. I don't know. Maybe there's a new term that's not values-based investing, but I think there's going to keep being this niche, but I hope growing segment of people that believe that your finance and the world that you want to see aren't things that you should think about separately. They are things that you should think about together. So what can you do? And then we'll go to Q&A. What can you do? Mostly just be curious. Being here is a great start. Be curious, ask questions is my guiding principle. If you want, you can learn more. Courses.ussif.org. It's my former employer. There's a 30-minute online. You can do it on your phone. You like flip through and learn little factoids about sustainable investing. It's a little bit more than I gave you here in certain areas. But we've actually covered many of the same things from my own perspective. If you want to actually start doing things with your money, the first thing to realize is that you are bigger than your money. You've got your network. Most of us probably have an alma mater. If you think back to the Vietnam War, to anti-apartheid, alongside those Catholic nuns, divestment. So you can ask, and divestment can mean current Israeli, it can also mean no fossil fuels, it can mean no tobacco. In general, there are a lot of different values that you could ask your alma mater. You could also just start by asking, do you think about any of this? They might already do it. Certain schools have a carve out of their fund that is socially responsible. You can dedicate your money there. Certain schools have a parallel fund. You can invest as your alma mater. Social Harvard, I think, has a social investment fund where if you donate to the alma mater through there, the money goes into like a separate mini endowment that is only socially responsibly invested, but still benefits the alma mater. If you are lucky enough to have a true union type pension, a pension fund, if you're a member of a teacher's organization, for example, your retirement fund as a whole is an enormous network. You can ask how that's invested. Any nonprofit you donate to that's big enough to have an endowment, Planned Parenthood, big churches, I do not know about Plymouth. Museums are another good example. They often have endowments. Sometimes it's all tied up in real estate, but you can ask. Let's get to your money. What can you do? Most of what I talked about was actually companies, public equities, bonds. But the best and easiest thing any of us can do is just move from a big bank to a credit union. Yes, I work at a big bank and I said that. Move to a credit union. The second best thing you can do, shop locally. The stats on it are unbelievable. It goes back to your local employment. It goes back to your local tax base. The factor difference between shopping either big multinational online or big multinational big box store versus shop locally, wildly different. Shop locally, shop small if you want to follow a boycott list. But basically, my message here is remember that your money is more than just your investments. It's also where you spend it. For your investments, for your retirement, at your company, 401k, you can go to investorvalues.org. You can learn, does your company retirement funds have any, what are they invested in? Do they have fossil fuels? You can download a letter from this website to send to your company to be like, I want to add sustainable stuff to our 401k if you don't already have it. Same thing on the personal side, same website. You can go, you can look for own mutual funds. You've got your own rollover IRA you're managing. You've got your own wealth you're managing. You can go there and look at mutual funds. If you have an advisor, ask them. Ask them. There are certifications you can learn about. It's in the resources tab, but just ask them. And then where you donate your money, as I mentioned, not only the endowment, but just in general, think about gifting, estate planning. That's part of your money. That's part of your finance bucket. We already use that to try and change the world. You can donate stock. You can list nonprofits as your IRA, as your retirement account, your company retirement account beneficiary. You're 24 and you just got your first job. You can put money in there and you can say, well, it doesn't need to go back to my parents. It can go to the Audubon Society. I don't know. If you have more than $2 to $5 million in wealth, if you're working with an advisor, you can ask about donor advised funds. That's a different way to gift, but it's generally not applicable until you're maybe even more than 5 million in net worth that's being invested. So that's what you can do. My top 3: alma mater, move to a credit union, shop small. Let's do some Q&A.
So you're welcome to, what we want to make sure that people can hear. We want to make sure Jane can hear the questions. So either you have to come up here to ask your question, which you're welcome to do, or you let me repeat your question so that Jane can hear it, okay? So that's our technological baseline for today. Mary Kay.
Is there information available about how companies treat immigrants?
Jane, is there information available on how companies treat immigrants?
I do
Okay.
not think that there is corporate required disclosure around it. So there's not like a complete data set. Every public company, I don't think, has to report on it. I do know that we are at the point in finance where some people are asking this question. And it tends to be driven from the top. Some very wealthy clients are now asking this question, which means we're in the very early days where some activist is going to start asking individual companies. They're going to start doing shareholder engagement. We're probably 8 to 10 years away from any required public disclosure or mutual funds around it, but it is a growing topic. You are not the first person I've heard ask about this, which means there's latent demand, but companies aren't yet required to disclose.
Okay, looks like a follow-on question.
Yeah, are there people on both sides of the issue making it a deal with companies?
Okay, Jane, are there people on both sides of that issue? So people asking for disclosure and people saying we want to have our corporations free to not disclose?
Not
Wait, sorry.
We want support for immigrants, or we want all immigrants out of the country?
Ah,
I guess this is not to be involved.
okay. So some investors might say we want to invest in companies that support immigrants. Others might say we want to support companies that want all immigrants out of the country. Look,
Yes, we are not yet at that place. I have only so far heard this talked about from the progressive side, but politics moves fast. Again, maybe in 4 years, this is something that state pension funds are talking about, and 8 to 10 years before the average person could maybe realistically invest based on it. But it's probably coming. It's probably coming. And so far, I've only heard about it desired from progressive side of the aisle so far.
okay. Thank you. Next question. Yeah, come on up.
Jane, thank you. That was a terrific presentation. Many of us at Plymouth are interested in, and have been from the beginning, at the problem of climate change and green investing. And I'm reminded in your talk that Bill McKibben went around the country right after the Obama election, 60 cities in 60 days, and he introduced the idea of divesting from fossil fuels. And at the time, they had like 100 million, a small college fund was all they had, and now it's in the trillions. The question is, has this had any effect? What do you think? And then a much smaller question, why credit unions versus banks? Thank you.
Great questions. I think the Bill McKibben example is a perfect example of this arc of starting with small. You start with a single endowment, an investor that really wants to see it happen, somebody trying to move the needle, and you end up gathering a ton of momentum. Has it changed anything? I would say yes. And I would say in particular, what it has done is it has sped up demand for and resulting legislation. So there's now a kind of TCFD framework. I forget what it stands for, but it's a carbon disclosure reporting framework passed in the EU. So we're starting to see a lot of the first level of regulation is often generally around visibility. Just disclose what you're doing, and then once everybody sees the whole pie and sees how much carbon is being emitted, then like maybe we'll start to restrict it. So I would say already we have seen the fossil-free movement really end up resulting in legislation that affects all companies, but it is driven by the same environmental, because what the fossil-free movement forced people to do was disclose what was along the entire supply chain. So even if it wasn't your main point of business, people started to realize, oh, you were involved in the production of this in further down the chain in scope 2 and scope 3. It forced people to debate, what does fossil fuel free really mean? Does it mean not owning Exxon? Does it mean they're only drilling, they're not actually emitting anything according to them? And so I would say Bill McKibben really fully moved the needle on this. And I will also say, just personally, it is still not enough. We are going to need so much more, likely government intervention. But any needles that have moved, large credit to Bill McKibben. Second, why credit unions? It goes back to the local. They loan out more to local businesses. They loan out smaller amounts to smaller entrepreneurs. They generally, and you can sometimes find credit unions that specialize in this. They focus on women, they focus on people of color, they focus on local lending in marginalized communities. So the same way I want you to shop locally, I also want you to bank locally. Think about where your money sleeps. Every dollar you deposit with your checking is really not spending its night in the bank. It's spending its night wherever the bank is making loans or wherever they're deploying their assets. And do you want them buying up local decrepit housing stock and sitting on it? Or do you want them loaning to local construction businesses?
Okay. Jane, a quick question from me. Could you spend just a minute on the resources page that I made a handout here so everybody has a copy of that, and just give us a quick rundown of what you would get from what you would be able to get from those resources. Thank you.
Absolutely, for sure. I mentioned the 30-minute online course. That's the first sub-bullet point under USCIF. USCIF.org is the general website for the company I used to work at. That's kind of the professional association field. So you can do two things there. I mean, you can do a lot of things. You can learn all about it if you want, but two things I might recommend for you. One is take the individual course. And two is, if you want to, look for a new financial advisor. If you want to, look for, you're like, I got old money from my rollover that I need to invest. I want to go look for a good mutual fund. They've got you can see who's a member here at USCIF. And generally, if they're a member, they're interested in sustainable finance. So that's what the two sub bullet points are. Invest your values. That's the one I mentioned you can use for your company 401k. You can use for yourself to also find mutual funds. They've got cool screeners. You go there and then you choose, oh, do I want to look for fossil fuel free stuff? Do I want to look for tobacco free stuff? Do I want to look for gender free stuff? You can look for all sorts of different things, and you can learn about mutual funds and ETFs that are available for the average person. Um, and then lastly, I just love Investopedia. This is some advice on how to find an advisor if you want to find one who focuses on sustainability. But also you can just go to Investopedia. You can Google sustainable finance. You can just learn stuff there. In general, Investopedia is a very solid resource.
Great. So, any other questions? Jim?
What about the boat?
Right. Jane, what about the boat?
Yeah, I included a bonus picture there. I live on a 47-foot motor yacht. She is 1972. She is older than I am. She was probably cheaper than your car. She was a little bit falling apart. And I was young and naive 4 years ago and knew nothing about boats. And I have spent 4 years making sure that she doesn't sink. She doesn't sink now, and learning how to drive her. And it's like driving two semis stacked on top of each other. It's terrifying. It is the hardest thing I've ever done, and I love it. And if you ever come to Washington, D.C., look me up on LinkedIn. I will give tours of the boat to anyone. She's my favorite thing in the whole wide world.
Follow-up question.
Is it docked in the Potomac, or where do you dock it?
Where is it docked?
Yeah, I am docked on the Washington Channel, which is just a little dugout area right next to the Potomac that leads up to the tidal basin where the cherry blossoms are. So I have a great view of the cherry blossoms and the Washington Monument.
Nice.
Final question, do you have extra room for the rest of us?
Do you have room for all of us aboard?
She is a 2-cabin boat, but I was really not kidding about buying a wreck of a boat. The forward cabin right now has a leak and the ceiling is falling down, and then it just gets pumped away and she's safe, but I wouldn't stay on her while it's raining. But the hope is in another 2 years, maybe I will have fixed that and you can then maybe stay. But at the very least, come out for an hour drive on the Potomac. Again, I love her. Any excuse to take her out.
Great. Okay. Well, given that, couple last things to finish up with. First, can we have a round of applause for a great presentation? Thank you, Jane. And then a quick reminder, there is no Sunday Forum next Sunday, which is Easter. And the week after that, we have another outstanding presentation, from the Native American Community Development Institute. And that's Bob Lilligren, whom some of you may remember from the Minneapolis City Council. But he and another gentleman, John Williams, are part of the Native American Community Development Institute, and we'll be talking about, obviously, Native American community development. So I think it'll be a great presentation, and look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Thanks, everybody. If you didn't get a handout, there are still some over on the table. So.